Hi, my research dragons. This is video number 3 about the research I'm doing now. And I want to make sure that you understand that you can do research on anything, something you see on TV, something you read in a newspaper or in a magazine or social media, or also conversations that you had. So I want to give you an example. I did 10 years of research on child sexual abuse based on one conversation I had during a picnic. I was having a picnic with my family in Massachusetts, and they all started talking about the scandal that was erupting in Boston, and I didn't know what scandal they were talking about. And they were talking about the child sexual abuse that happened with the Catholic Church. And my godmother was the bookkeeper for the diocese, the second largest diocese in New England. And everyone at the table was against the victims. Yes, that's right. They were in favor of the priests. And I was just astounded by that. And so that got me thinking about the civil trials that were going to come our way with, the cases in Massachusetts and all over, which eventually it all failed. But I did 10 years of research just based on one conversation, one thing that someone said that I found completely unbelievable, and that led to so much research on child sexual abuse, on the types of cases, on the types of individuals in those cases. And I was in 2 Oscar-nominated movies on TV and the radio, doing all kinds of stuff, testifying before Congress, testifying before the Ohio Supreme Court, just on a conversation. So you never know where research is going to lead you. Which brings me to my current research. So in February, I went up for 3 weeks to South Africa because I was going to do some research on climate change as a toxic tort. And I have research partners in Australia, as I mentioned before, and Canada. And I was meeting with some researchers in South Africa so that we could do research on climate change. While I'm there, there was a COVID outbreak, okay? And I'm there and I'm hearing about, cases in the United States, in Seattle, and this is happening, and something's happening in China, and something's happening in Italy. And we're sitting in South Africa and we're thinking, well, there's only one case in South Africa, and that guy came from Italy. And, we were in South Africa, Swaziland, Lesotho, Botswana. We're all over the southern part of Africa. And it's getting more and more serious. I came back to Tiffin on March 10th. I passed through 8 international airports and was not checked, not even once. Not once was I screened. And it was funny because when I came back, I didn't feel well. I just thought it was, that 5 million hour flight that we were on. But I was tested and came out negative, but now I know the tests are not accurate. So, oh well, we'll see what happens there. But when we went to Swaziland, they tested us. And by testing, they meant they took our temperature. Okay, that's not testing. But we weren't tested. I'm hearing that when I came back, don't worry, everyone is checked when they come to the United States. And I came in through New York. You think that, I don't know, New York would be one of those ones that they were testing. And that was absolutely not true. And they were saying it was true even when I was there. Nobody tested us. We came in from an international flight. You think, I don't know, they would test that. So that made us curious. So my research partners are saying, we should do this because it's happening now and we really need to focus on this. So we decided that we would do research on COVID-19 and compare the United States, Australia, Canada, and South Africa. And right off the bat, I was worried about health discrepancies for minority populations, because I was thinking to myself that under normal conditions, there is a great disparity in health care in the United States between minorities and non-minorities. And when you have a pandemic at hand, I think that would get worse, okay? And I think that it would get worse in other countries. So we started asking each other questions, just some basic questions, like what are we going to study? We're going to study the infection rate. We're going to study testing. We're going to study how they determine who's being infected. We're going to study how they determine who's being tested. We're going to look at the rates in all those different countries and what sort of mitigations that they're doing. We're going to look at the death rates as well. We're going to look at the change in infection from day to day. We're going to look at minority status. Now, minority status turned out to be a dreadful way, I should say no way, of keeping track. Because when I started looking into it, I found that only 12 states were keeping track of minority infection. Only 12 states. It wasn't until Wisconsin started publishing, because Wisconsin was one of those 12 states, and saying that minorities are being infected at a 50% higher rate than non-minorities. And I said, oh my God, I knew this was going to happen, and this is what's happening. And when I found out that only 12 states are keeping track of this, well, now all the states are keeping track of this, but I think that that wouldn't have happened had Wisconsin not said, hey, this is what's going on. And then they were all like, oh, maybe we should keep track of that. Yeah. So it brings out some of the holes in research, okay? So if you're trying to solve a problem, which this pandemic is a problem, we have to know the breadth, the scope, the progression of this problem to properly research it. Now I got to tell you about South Africa when we were down there. So you know South Africa is a country that has been ripped apart by apartheid, and I think in the Western world we think it's all in the men. However, there are shanty towns in South Africa that are full of people. At least 5 million people live in some sort of shanty town where they're just slums, okay? And the white government moved black Africans out to these shanty towns and said, here, you can live here. Ironically, prior to, when the apartheid was really big, they were living in very desirable areas, and they said, no, 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 you can't live here, you have to go live here. And they pushed them out into these areas. And I went into those areas with the researchers, and we talked to some of the people that live there, and it was horrifying. There's no running water, there's no electricity. Sometimes they hook up makeshift electrical wires to like lines that are on the highway, and they bootleg electricity that way. But there's outhouses, there's let me see what this, 7 toilets per 150 people. And in one shanty town alone called Caliste, there's 400,000 people with 7 toilets for every 150 people. And I remember these are shanty towns. People live there. So they have what they call grocery stores that are really basically just farm stands. They're not really grocery stores. And they have no running water. And they have schools that were just like, one-room buildings or with some other kind of very basic building with outhouses there for all the kids to use. It was just quite horrifying to see. And I remember when I was there talking to people, going through my mind silently, this has nothing to do with COVID, but going through my mind silently is, oh my God, this is a breeding ground for cholera. And that's what I was thinking. The conditions are very unsanitary, and they must have problems with cholera. Here's an issue. People are not in there measuring illness. And they have little clinics, not really hospitals, but little clinics with a cot. And maybe they have a nurse that'll come in and look at them. So when someone dies, they just say, oh yeah, they died. They were sick and they died. There's no recorded sort of, this person died of this and this person died of that, because they're like the poor dead people and they just died of illness, okay? So when you keep records like that, we don't know how disease progresses. And a disease doesn't care if it's in a shanty town or in the Ritz. The disease is going to go where the disease is going to go. And it behooves all of us to know everything as much as we can about every situation, researching every kind of illness, or else we're doomed. Not only that, but you have to record that for posterity, because imagine if we didn't know what we did during the influenza outbreak. Historically, we go back and we look at those things and learn from the lessons of the past. Oh, they tried this and it didn't work, so let's not go there, okay? And that guides us in the present to not commit the mistakes of the past. But you're not going to know that unless you do research about it. So these are the dilemmas that we're looking at today. So I know in South Africa they have a published infection rate and a published death rate, and it's got to be soaringly higher than what it is, because I know they're not testing in those towns where 4 million people live. They're not testing in there. So it's got to be much, much higher. And I'll tell you, when a pandemic breaks out in a place like Southern Africa or the continent of Africa, it's going to go everywhere, and it's going to be impossible to contain because they just don't have the medical facilities like other places do. So what makes you think that that's not going to travel everywhere else? And what about those poor people that are there? They need help. As if we didn't learn from Ebola or HIV or things like that. I really don't think we did, because we have this disparity between wealthy and poorer people and people of color and Caucasians and people in first class versus third world or first world or those kinds of things. And that's going to come and get us someday. So while I'm sitting there thinking of cholera and typhus for those places, I didn't even think about COVID, which was a distinct possibility, and I think is a distinct possibility. I mean, people are using buckets instead of toilets and then just throwing them out into the streets. It's very unsanitary. They have high crime there in addition to all of those things. And, here's the interesting thing. There's 90% unemployment in those shanties, 90%. And the people that do work, they get into these crowded minivans and they go off into the city and they work in fancy tourist places like hotels and things like that. Don't you think the virus would travel with them? Just something to think about. And then one of the things that they're trying to combat in South Africa is those same crowded vans take children to schools in different parts of the country, and there's a high death rate for kids just traveling to school in those vans. So that's South Africa. Canada is having the same kind of issues as the United States, and Canada right now is trying to extend its closed border because they don't want the Americans to come up and infect Canada. Canada only has 10% of the population of the United States, and they do have COVID everywhere in Canada, but not to the extent of the United States. And so that's very interesting as well. Australia, when we started talking to our friends in Australia, the Australians told me, they're not testing the Aboriginal people. So whatever Australia is publishing, they're not. That too is higher than it actually is. But they have a smaller population, and they've been doing quarantine. And their population is a little bit different because it's all along the coastline. There's not many people on the interior, and those people are the Aboriginals. So I think COVID is all over the place, everywhere. So we do have to look at different things that are going on. So we're just looking at COVID. Now, what happens when you have some people in a place like in South Africa where they have poverty conditions and may have comorbidity and other kinds of illnesses that are happening as well? What about malaria? Because malaria is a thing. I had to take malaria medication. What about typhus? What about cholera? All of those things that are probably present there. What does that do to augment COVID? Does it make it worse? Does it make it mutate? All of those kinds of things. So you know that those people have unsanitary conditions. You know they're probably subject to like lice or fleas or mites or things like that. Those also spread typhus and other kinds of disease as well. On the next video, sorry, I'm just got a little bit more to go, but I want to talk about the secret weapon of research. And I'll continue this on another video.